You all. I'm Vicky Bergvall, as most of you I think know, and I'm the chair of the KUUF Justice Ministry. I'm also a professor emerita of linguistics retired from Michigan Tech, and I've been researching language and the power of discourse over the last 45 years or so of my career. I focus particularly on how scientists and the public talk about issues of science, but particularly about sex, gender, sexuality, and particularly the mind and brain. The comments I make here today follow from comments I made in early December at that very vociferous discussion that took place at the Houghton County Commissioners, and following on Bucky's words of last week. I was one of about 24 UU members who were there, and if you know our congregation size, about 84, 86, about a third of our congregation that was there, either outside in the rally or inside, or stood in line for hours to wait to speak. I think about 8 of us, if I recall, spoke in person to the commissioners. And we were, of course, talking about that resolution that they had that to declare that there were only 2 sexes, XX and XY. Unfortunately, it was voted down 4-1. My first reaction on hearing about the resolution the week before, the Friday before, was that this was totally absurd. Rather like the story of King Canute, who stood on the shore of England and ordered the waves to halt. No surprise, the waves didn't halt. Now, as a linguist, I study speech act theory, which considers how we can, with certain, in some cases, bring about action through words. The states of the world are made by certain kinds of declarations, by doing things with words, as Austin said. Now, while Canute couldn't halt the waves with his words, legislators can do many things. They can make laws to declare national holidays. They can give licenses to people to perform marriages, as my husband did for our son. And they can do a number of other kinds of warnings or promises. You can all do these speech acts yourself. I promise you that I will pay you. I warn you that you will be unhappy if you don't, etc. However, the act of declaring that there are only 2 sexes is not a speech act that our county commission has the authority to enact. Biology, like Canute's recognition of those inexorable waves, is a force that exceeds the power of speech acts. The declaration that one is a girl or a boy is usually based on a visual inspection of external genitalia at birth, and not chromosomes, as the council would have it. But there are many forces at work about whether and how one's body actually expresses such overt biological signals. Medical and scientific advances over the last century have shown us that there are more than 2 chromosome expressions, not just XX and XY, but triple X and XXY, single X, and other kinds of human sexual variations. And the very expressions of chromosomes and sex and sexuality are themselves regulated by other genes in the body, including the SRY gene, which regulates androgen and the timing of becoming a male, etc. And the concentrations of hormonal secretions during gestation and birth and through and beyond puberty all affect how we are sexed in our lives, how our sexes are revealed. So we do indeed have intersex and transsex, and people who do not fit easy binaries. Thus, talking about sex is quite complicated. And why people can utter all kinds of decrees, whether such decrees make reality depends. Mostly usually on a complex of biological and social truths, not simply a one person's wish for such words to be true. Unfortunately, we as humans are all too good at another kind of language, that is using words to separate us from them, to exclude or render as other those who don't fit neat categories, often erasing their humanity. And that's what I wish to speak with you today about, how we as Unitarian Universalists can bear witness in our support for the LGTBQ community through our actions and our words. That's what we are, that's what we do. And it's an important part of what leads me to propose today this message. And our discussion is part of our yearly proof and a commitment to the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, that we at the KUUF Unitarian Universalist Fellowship are indeed a welcoming congregation to the LGTBQ community. So what can I add to that discussion that hasn't already been discussed? A lot of you were there that night and know a lot of what was said. But as a linguist by training and profession, I want to talk about a few words here that I think are important. I want to meditate with you about the power of language and our role as UUs in this community during these fraught times. In my 3 minutes of comments, to the Houghton County Board of Commissioners at their December meeting, I spoke of that push and pull between the declaration that there were only two sexes and the science that others and I have been studying. As Bucky spoke about that last week, it's a pervasive myth that there are only two sexes, male and female, and it's a persuasive and pervasive myth believed by many who adhere to the idea that the words in the Bible are exact citations of infallible God. But I'm a little reluctant to take my science from a book of stories that began being compiled about 2,500 years ago. As far as I know, there was very little chromosomal testing that took place inside or outside the Garden of Eden. And maybe we've learned a lot, maybe a little bit in the last couple of millennia, certainly now in the last 100 years, in the last couple of decades. We know that the sex issue is much more complicated than a simple expression of whether one has a second X or maybe a Y chromosome. We know now, and many of us have heard witness to so many brave souls who stood for hours and stood up to speak on that snowy night in December, that there are many who live among us with other chromosomal variations, and maybe up to 3% of births, of people who might be ambiguously sexed, intersexed, less clearly female and male, and over the course of a lifetime may show differential expressions of hormones that deliver different primary and secondary sexual characteristics. Anyone who does any kind of serious sex and gender research recognizes that there are those who walk among us pretty clearly unambiguously female or male, but what do we do about those who don't? Do we force them to fit into restrictive binary labels that don't fit their lived experience? What many groups, such as the Native Americans, would call two-spirited peoples who live among us. So on that day in December, we saw the bravery of those whose bodies and brains don't fit into those binary boxes, and their many, many allies speak out against that resolution that there are only two boxes, XX and XY. I want to talk next about the word recognize, because I think it's at the heart of some problems here. The root of the word recognize is from the French connaître, and it comes from the Latin to know, to cognito. To recognize is literally to know again, and if we see a friend on the street, we recognize that we know them, and we acknowledge that fact by nodding or saying hi, perhaps stopping to talk. To recognize is also a term that is used by a chair of a meeting who calls on someone and allows them to speak. The chair recognizes Senator X from Michigan. To know someone but not recognize them is also known as delivering the cut direct. And many of us have felt the cruelty of being cut by a friend who suddenly refuses to acknowledge us as they walk by us. And that's what's happened in that resolution, the failure to recognize someone else's humanity, as if they didn't fit into the two neatly defined boxes, they didn't belong. And we've never had chromosomal testing widely at birth, nor do we have any clear idea, most of us know what our chromosomes even are. In fact, many who find out they are non-binary in those ways discover it only through unexpected chromosomal testing later in life. But that lack of testing didn't stop the proposer of the Houghton County resolution. We shouldn't be surprised that it came up in Houghton. We have a lot of conservative Christians around us, but only perhaps that it took so long. Because if we go back 12 months ago to the inauguration day of this new president we see a similar declaration on January 20th in a flurry of other executive orders. And I want to read part of that one order to you. It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. Under my direction, Trump said, the executive branch will enforce all sex-protective laws to promote this reality, and the following definitions will govern all executive interpretation of and application of federal law and administrative policy. And they had some other language about the large cell people who are female who have ova, and the small cell people who have sperm, etc. And again, the complaint I have here is this as a resolution to declare that there are only two sexes. Now, let me stop again for a bit more linguistic parsing. There's one thing for one commissioner on our local board to wish mistakenly to force the declaration, wisely refused by four others, that there are only two sexes. But the U.S. government does have the right and the power to legislate and declare policy. And that's what the U.S. Declaration did. It is a policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. No matter who else you are, they only recognize two. As a local county board, such declarations might not carry much weight. However, the U.S. government has much more power to enforce its worldview through other policies by how it chooses to write forms, like your birth forms, your death forms, to spend money, to write laws about such other things as bathroom access, limit access to health care, penalize those doctors and those hospitals that do offer trans care. And the current executive branch of the United States has made it clear that it only recognizes the two boxes. It only sees you and acknowledges your right to exist or to speak out if you shove yourself into one of those two boxes, no matter the biological reality that exists outside of those two words. So what are we as Unitarian Universalists to do, given that awful, awful might of the U.S. government, with its declarations and its recognitions, even when they don't match our own recognition of so many inconvenient facts? Well, we don't have to agree, and we don't have to comply. But more importantly, we do have to act, which brings me to the second half of this message. I believe in many things: the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the UU principle that recognizes the worth and dignity of every human and being. For me, all that supersedes anything that comes out of this single executive order. So what are we as UUs who also believe in the worth and dignity of every human being in the world to do? We must choose to respond not by turning away, but by turning toward our friends who break the boundaries of sex, the binaries, to recognize in them the spark of humanity that deserves its own right to be seen, recognized, and nurtured, and to be welcomed into our congregation. As UUs, we are called upon not merely to look at others around us who have less with pity, but when faced with being downtrodden and weary with all the burdens they carry, to give a hand up, to welcome them as full members of our beloved wider community. We are called to empathy. Whether you've lived a non-binary life experience or not, you know someone who has. And we are called to extend to them our hearts and our hands as full members of our community. Through empathy, we express that we can imagine ourselves into their positions and that we back them against the forces who would attempt to negate their full right to full personhood in our nation. It is the act of understanding, at least attempting to understand as best we can, someone else's feelings, to put ourselves in their shoes, in their minds. It supersedes sympathy, that feeling with, to get more deeply into feeling into empathy, the feeling of someone else's experience. This is very important, to recognize that our own worldview is not the only one, to see when others suffer for their positions in the world and feel deeply for them. But is that enough? If we stop at fellow feeling and do nothing else, we have failed in some deep way. We need to move beyond empathy to compassion, the next step, which is to move beyond feeling to do something to help alleviate someone else's suffering. As UUs, that can mean actively bearing not only overt witness to their feelings, but also to their rights to exist peaceably in this world, and to offer a spiritual sanctuary for them, as we try to do in our commitment as a welcoming congregation for the UUA. For example, we show up at the Pride Fest in early June, and we have a prominent table where we've given away, for example, many rainbow peace necklaces. At this building, we have hosted the yearly Trans Day of Remembrance around November 20th. Each year is a safe space for the gathering of those who wish to remember and honor the many who have died for being transgender, those who are overwhelmed by the harms of a society that does not recognize their difference. Other ministers like Bucky and Carol Grafford have given sermons that directly welcome the LGTBQ community, and Horst Schmidt hosted an online presentation by a national UUA figure, Reverend Ali Bell, welcoming not only the LGBT community, but also the communities of the neurodiverse and communities of color. We read books, too, and teach our children in religious education lessons of welcome. And we honor and recognize and welcome those who tread a more dangerous and harrowing path in today's America as diverse members of our community. Thus, we seek to reiterate how we support our LGTBQ communities as friends and allies, as equal partners in our congregational polity, to welcome all who come to our doors. And we step forward to offer witness at events such as the Houghton County Board of Commissioners, and this afternoon at 5 o'clock at the Good Shepherd Lutheran Church, when others seek to define our friends out of the membership of human beings, including immigrants. We do this especially in the face of some of those on the Christian right who say that empathy is wrong, in fact, that it's evil. In her book, Toxic Empathy, How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion, Allie Beth Stuckey argues that those of liberal persuasions or faith traditions work to actively misuse empathy to sell a political perspective. She particularly focuses on what she calls 5 lies. In her book, she rails against those like me who believe that abortion is health care, that trans women are women, and that same-sex marriages have love is love. She argues that the slogan, "No human is illegal," means that we'll be overwhelmed by tides of immigration and asylum seekers coming to the U.S. And she argues against the notion of social justice as justice, saying that Black Lives Matter turns us against police. Her remedy against what she sees as these many lies is to instead accept her version of the love of Jesus, to tout the one true path to real empathy by pushing what she sees as the one true path to religion and truth. But what if you don't agree with her one church's interpretation of the Bible, thinking there may be more than one path to enlightenment, beyond that power and path offered by her one sect worship of Jesus? After all, only about 31% of the world is Christian, and I hate to condemn the rest of the world. And even many Christians vehemently disagree with each other and don't follow that tradition that Stuckey espouses. I've seen students in my classes talk about how the Christians versus the Catholics, for example, is a topic of debate. And from what we've seen, their people are prepared to come to blows to defend their version of Christian love and acceptance. We've seen the Crusades and other cases. From where I stand, the tragedy and toxicity is on the side of those who fight trans rights, abortion, immigration, not in those who seek to fight oppression, including people like Alex Petty, who died yesterday, and Renee Nicole Good, before him in Minneapolis, who stood up to oppressive ICE militia in case of Renee Good after taking her son to school, being brutally murdered in her car, or Alex being shot yesterday, standing up for another woman, trying to prevent her from being pepper sprayed. Good was called by our Vice President, J.D. Vance, a victim of left-wing ideology, or paid Antifa, who was spurred by an alleged network of politically motivated groups to interfere with law enforcement. Vance said, "I can believe that her death is a tragedy, while also recognizing that it is a tragedy of her own making. Blaming the victims for their own death is not what we should do for people who are peacefully protesting. Making someone who is out helping others into the victim and then investigating them, Renee Good and her wife, or Alex Petty, as domestic terrorists are clearly outrages that we must protest. But we must move beyond outrage to action, beyond empathy to compassion, to joint action, to protest against a government that targets its own citizens. And in future weeks, I hope you will help me join with more postcards to send to our elected officials." I'd like to end today with a statement made in Boston, Massachusetts on November 12th, 2025. Our Unitarian Universalist Association President, UUA, the Reverend Sophia Betancourt, joined 10 other heads of diverse religious traditions in issuing a landmark statement proclaiming that transgender, intersex, and non-binary people are worthy of love, support, and protection, as are all citizens, in fact, and those who work for a better life in America. This statement said, "Too many entrusted with positions of power are demonizing transgender people and others, blaming them for acts of violence, and criminalizing their very right to occupy space in our common life. The fear that many have, many transgender children, their families, and their loved ones, and I add here immigrants' families, is unacceptable. The drive to limit the ways that transgender intersex, and non-binary people authentically live their lives by limiting the medical care they receive, ignoring and sometimes provoking acts of violence against them, preventing them from traveling freely, or keeping them from participating in public activities is a betrayal of our deeply held values as people of faith. She continues, as a nation, we have often failed to live up to the ideals of equality and justice that safeguard the foundation of a free society. Yet throughout our history, in periods of great struggle and division, people of faith and goodwill have come forward to defend the very values that defined American democracy. It is from that religious legacy that we speak today. And she finishes, when people of faith and conscience stay silent in the face of oppression, we are all made less whole. When people of faith and conscience speak out against that which violates the sacred in its own name, we have the power to stay the hand of sin. Transgender, non-binary, and intersex people are vulnerable today. Our faiths, our theologies, and our practices of prophetic witness call on us to say with one voice to transgender people among us, you are holy, you are sacred, we love you, we support you, and we will protect you. So I invite you to join a discussion after our music today with more ways that we as KUUF members can be more visible as we seek to promote social justice, including welcoming and supporting our many LGTBQ friends. And by the words of our opening song, compassion is our home and will be known by our love. Thank you.